Hi, everyone. I'm John Lucades, and I'm going to be talking with you today about patching. And in my experience, I went from doing government security evaluations to responding to vulnerabilities that were reported in firmware and hardware. And now I'm here at Eclipsium trying to actually make these things possible for real organizations. If you look at this space since the beginning, we've been sort of following the same trajectory that we've been seeing with other software, where very trivial bugs, easily exploitable, are just rampant all over the place. And the problem is that people aren't looking and aren't able to actually take action because it's too complicated. And this is the area of firmware as it stands today. This is slowly changing, but it's very slow and it's at least 2 decades behind. If you look at what happened with operating systems, we did go through a cycle where we had to patch a lot of stuff, and then we were very unhappy because the patches broke. And we also had situations where you had these bugs that were almost unpatchable. They were so prevalent, and you fix it in one place and you find it in another. This is all part of the software supply chain. And the software supply chain doesn't stop with applications, operating systems, and networks. It goes all the way down to firmware and hardware. And even down there, we've got these libraries that are 2 decades old that you're still depending on that have the same exploitable bugs that you've been hearing about since, the ping of death from, the 90s. If we start to look at what's actually exploited in the wild, we can start to get a good understanding of where we can focus our attention next and what we can do now. That's what our blog post is about, and that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. Okay, so let's talk about patching for a minute. When you have the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency going and publishing something that says these are the routinely exploited CVEs, both in 2020 and 2021, those are probably the things that you're more worried about. And so in 2020, when 4 out of 12 of these CVEs happen to be firmware related, and in 2021, it's 11 out of 16, you're talking about some serious attention on something that you don't usually think about. You're talking about attention on firmware. And that is designed to be something you ignore. Firmware is something that we usually just expect to work. And if you're dealing with it, you're dealing with it because something's wrong. In this case, because adversaries are attacking it. And they're attacking it because it's something that people don't look at and don't control. That makes it a great target for adversaries. So that's the thing. I actually want to help the problem of somebody who has to come in over the weekend on a holiday and patch one of these random routers or VPN concentrators or pieces of equipment that really should just work. But now you have this pile of CVEs that's being exploited actively in a campaign and putting the entire organization at risk. So if you look at this particular problem, you kind of in a bind. You're between a rock and a hard place, where if you do install the patches quickly in an emergency fashion over the weekend, you're going to put the organization at risk because you can't really test it well. You don't have the time for that. You have to get the new patch installed. But if you go get that new patch installed as quickly as possible, and you end up bringing down the remote access VPN, then you just really pissed off a whole lot of people. And it's going to be a problem for that next week of work that everybody's going to come back to. So you need to actually have something more than just, I'm going to throw the patches around. What you want is really more attuned to this whole zero trust architecture that people are trying to build both across the US government and in the private sector. And this zero trust architecture really sort of is predicated on the ability to verify what it is you have. And so if I have an emergency patch, I want to be able to verify that the device has not already been compromised. There are plenty of examples of malware that actually looks for updates and goes ahead and implants the update while it installs. Any sort of activity that you expect to trust a device is sort of inherently flawed. You want to be able to actually verify that that trust is earned, that the device is trustworthy. So in this case, what we're really suggesting here is that it's not just throwing patches around. It's identifying what specific devices are at risk, verifying that they are working properly and haven't already been infected, and then fortifying those devices by installing patches and configuring them properly and doing all of the other things that are part of our environment, but not just at the software level, down to the firmware and hardware levels. The fact is, a lot of our IT operations staff is overloaded already. And if we give them all of these emergency patches that they have to install right away, and they can't really check things the way that they know they want to, we're just going to create more problems. And the attacker sort of strategy depends on that property. You're kind of hosed either way. And so we can break this by doing a little bit of work up front, by architecting systems in a way that we can verify them. And that requires tools. That requires something that tells you what there is out there that needs to be looked at, fixed. And it requires something that tells you whether or not it is behaving normally or abnormally. Something is broken, something is compromised. And then you can do the work of fortifying these devices, of actually installing patches, reconfiguring, making things better. But that's an ongoing iterative process. If you don't have something that you can sort of rely on behind that, you're going to be in trouble. If you sort of look at the reason why Eclipsium exists, it's because we know we have these problems. I've been talking to people for quite a few years now about firmware updates. And recently we've had actual studies by folks like Microsoft and recently also HP that show over 80% of people actually either having experienced problems like this in firmware or knowing for sure that this is a significant risk to their organization. If you look at those sort of numbers, we all kind of know that this is a problem. No one should be surprised that firmware has issues, just like every other piece of software. What is sort of abnormal is being able to actually do something about it. And that's what Eclipsium is here to do. That's why we exist. The fun part is we did this at first by becoming security researchers and trying to understand deeply how to attack these systems down at the firmware layer, down at the hardware layer. And what we learned was that there are commonalities, there are common techniques that are going to work regardless of what hardware I have. They're going to work regardless of what you may have done to configure the device, because the good stuff, the really interesting attacks, those are the ones that you kind of can't get out of. You're either hosed because you did it one way or you're hosed because you did it the other way. No good options. And so what we do is we look for that and we actually build that into the analysis that we're looking for. And that looks like this really, it sounds like it should be complicated, but it's actually this really simple concept of a device profile. The theory is that every device has a normal way of operating, and that's its device profile. If you start to see certain properties of that device profile, you can do research and figure out that's a vulnerability. Or you could do research and figure out, yeah, that's not a vulnerability, but it has implications and you probably want to think about that. For example, you can have secure boot, and secure boot has all sorts of implementations. You can do it different ways. If you use the UEFI implementation and you check signatures at different stages of the boot process, you have to deal with the fact that somebody somewhere is going to sign something and then regret it. It could be because it's vulnerable. It could be because it actually turned out to be malicious and they were compromised themselves. One way or another, you have to revoke certificates. And now you have to distribute revocation lists. And guess what? Most people don't have the latest revocation lists. So that just means I can bypass secure boot by using something that was actually authorized to be run at some point with a real signature. Unfortunately, it happens to have these properties of that profile. And we can look for that. And we can sort of say, okay, I've collected all of this information. Now I can see that property of secure boot. First of all, is it on? Are you using it at all? And which version of the revocation list do you have? Now that's a vulnerability. If we keep going and we start to look at the behaviors of the system and we start to see, yeah, okay, it has this vulnerability, but it always boots the same stuff every time. The things that it's booting are okay. Great. That's a different sort of analysis. That's more of a deviation from expectation, a deviation from normal. In that case, we're talking more about compromise. And so really, we actually plug in to existing processes of an organization. We plug into a vulnerability management, risk management process, and we tell you about things that should be improved in the environment. But we also plug into a security operations side of the business, which will tell you when you need to send an incident response team to actually do something. Maybe you need to quarantine that system because it's actually doing weird stuff. Or maybe somebody actually took that system out of the authorized configuration and they knew that shouldn't be okay. So you need to go do something about that. So the one other thing that might be worth thinking about here is that this isn't just our sort of opinion, our thought about some interesting set of vulnerabilities. This is actually what government agencies, and not even just the US government, this was a joint advisory by the US and other governments, that really is telling you this is what's routinely exploited. You see this all the time. And then it's not just those agencies that are having to respond to that problem that are involved here. NIST, which creates the standards around how we talk to and deal with things in cybersecurity, they are actively working on a collaborative effort that Eclipsium is participating in. And that effort is enterprise patching. And you can take enterprise patching, which is a hard problem all by itself, but you can take that all the way down to firmware and you're not really changing the difficulty. It's just as hard as it was before, but it's not any harder. And the interesting part is that as part of a zero trust environment or any kind of environment that is going to actually get some verification of the devices in use, you're going to need to deal with enterprise patching. And they are publishing, and we're collaborating in the publication of this 1800 series, what effectively is a how-to guide, how to deploy enterprise patching and include firmware and do it at scale and do it with all of these tools. And they're actually going to tell you how to configure those tools and put them together. Definitely something to check out. Definitely something that I think NIST is really on the right track, trying to solve real world problems that everybody has. And it's a real tractable problem. We can actually do this today. It was actually intractable before.